All right. Well, thank you very much for being here, and thank you to the organizers for having me back again. This is, as I said, the second time I'm doing this, and it's a real pleasure to see new faces as well as returning faces. And I hope that the next 20 minutes or so of what I say and what you will say will be meaningful. Who am I? Okay. Well, maybe the introduction is one answer to that. And I'm done, right? I can go and sit down. And that's one way of answering that question. But how do we answer this question if we want to relate it to personalized care in terms of making a diagnosis, in terms of giving treatments to our patients? We have to understand the I, the individual, the patient, in order to be able to offer whatever we do. Okay? Erica made a very interesting comment at the beginning. I don't know where Erica is, but she made a very, oh, there you are, made a very interesting comment about individual health and community health, and the links between the two and the interrelationship between the two. And it's very important that the harmony is maintained. The I and the we, when we talk about the who am I, maybe we should think about the we rather than the I, okay? And you might have heard this before, this notion of illness and wellness. When you start your journey from the I, you end up in illness, and when you start the journey from we, you end up in wellness. That's the only difference between the two, right? And so there is a concept of wellness, which is the community that is within you as well, right? And people have talked about that in many, many different ways. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about sort of the biology, maybe a little bit into the chemistry, and maybe if we can and we feel brave enough, maybe get into the physics. And I'm just going to throw out some concepts, some ideas, and hope to get some responses from you. And then maybe we can link it back to the survey, the questions that you went through. Okay, so one way of looking at who we are, and this is going to be a different answer for each one of you, obviously, right? It's not going to be the same answer for me that might be the same answer for you. And that's, I think, the beauty of this question. The only way that I think you can get the answer to this question is through your own discovery, journey of self-discovery. That's the only way you can get this answer, okay? And everybody's answer is going to be different, but you want the answer that is appropriate for yourself, okay? So one way of looking at the biology is the basis of life in many ways is the cell, right? I think everybody would agree with that. So one way of thinking about who we are as individuals is that we are a collection of cells. We start off as a single cell, and then we multiply, we become 2, and then 4, and ultimately we are how many ever cells we are now. Anybody have a number that they want to throw up? How many cells do you think we are? 40 trillion? Anybody agree with that, disagree, higher, lower? It's not an auction, but that's okay. That's a fair number, 50 trillion, 100 trillion, different estimates. It's a large number. So one way of describing ourselves is that we are a collection of cells. And we are a collection of different types of cells, right? Now, do we have anything else within us or on us other than these 100 trillion cells or 40 trillion cells? Microbiome, right? Is there any estimate of the ratio between the human and the non-human cells?
Microbiome is bigger.
Bigger, how many times? 10 times bigger. Absolutely.
What about by mass?
By mass, you tell me. By number is 10 times bigger. By mass, it may or may not be the same, right? But I'll come to the genetic material in a moment. We'll get there, and we'll talk about the mass, we'll talk about the numbers. So one way of thinking about us is that we are a colony of the microbiome, the bacteria, the fungus, with a little bit of human cells in us. It's one way of thinking about who we are. And there's a lot of research that suggests that many things that we experience in life is actually related to the non-human component of us, the non-human cells. So let's talk about the genetic material, maybe dig a little bit deeper into the cell for a moment. How many genes do we have? Roughly. We have the whole human genome mapped out. We thought when we started the Human Genome Project that we may end up with about 100,000 genes. That was a huge overestimate. Any idea for the number of genes that we have as humans? 23,000. He's not a plant, by the way, but thank you for all the answers. So we have 23,000 genes. Any estimate of the genetic material, the number of genes of the microbiome, all this other stuff? 2 million. So 99% of the genetic material we're carrying around is really not human. Another way of thinking about who am I? There is a lot of evidence that the microbiome genetic material actually exchanges with a human gene. And not only does it exchange, it can actually be passed on to future generations. So, and how does the microbiome find its way into us? Is the microbiome static? It changes. It changes on your lifestyle, it changes on your diet, it changes on a lot of things. So your decisions of where you live, how you live, what you do, what you eat, affects you, but it also affects your future generations. Because of some changes in your biochemistry, some changes in your genetic makeup, perhaps the health of your individual cells. So it's an interesting way to think about who am I and what my responsibility is, this idea, going back to the idea of harmony between the individual and the environment. So when we come to the survey, I'm going to link it back to the survey in a moment. When we come to the survey, we obviously go through an evaluation of our likes and dislikes. Was there anything in the survey that came as a surprise to anyone? In terms of the question, why are we asking this question? Was there anything in the survey? Or I don't know if any of you got a chance to discuss this amongst your little groups, or maybe just reflected on it on your own. So, if you look at the survey, it starts off with things like height, weight, and so on. Everybody feels that that's okay. You need to know about height and weight, I guess, right? But there were lots of other things in there that had nothing to do with physical attributes, right? What you like to eat and whether you get angry and those types of things. Is that a better description, or is that how much of that is part of who am I? Is that a more accurate description? Would you weigh that, give it higher weightage? How many would give that higher weightage than the cells and genes that we have? Nobody. Okay. I think people are a little apprehensive of raising their hands, thinking, I won't call you out, don't worry, okay? So one way of thinking about us is, let me ask you a question, okay? Everybody can participate in this. And you have to do this instantly. The moment the question is asked, you have to act on it, okay? Point to yourselves. So most people said they did this. Okay, I saw a few people doing this. I guess that's one way of pointing to yourself. Very few people said this. Right? What's in here? Brain. A monkey. Would we say that that's the mind? No. Where's the mind? Never mind. But that's a very interesting question. We talk about mind-body medicine. Have we really understood what the mind is? And are we mostly mind, or what's the balance between mind and body? We talk about cells, genetic material. That's all, body. We'll agree with that. That's sort of the physicality of who we are. But people often talk about the mind, and we really don't know what the mind is, right? People talk about all aspects of the mind. You may talk about memories, you may talk about identity, you may talk about preconditioning. There are all these different aspects of mind, okay? How much of that is actually within the brain? What about, let's just take memory, for example. Where's memory? Okay, any more answers? Cells. Every cell has memory. What you described as hippocampus is conscious memory. Consciousness.
There's several kinds of consciousness.
Okay, consciousness. We'll come to consciousness. What is consciousness?
Residing in the heart.
Residing in the heart. Okay, which chamber? No. What is the heart? What is the heart?
In the middle of the body.
Is it not residing in any other organ?
In the gut.
Main consciousness.
Well, this is a conversation we can have for a long time, right? Because,
I don't think so.
oh no, we can argue with that because the consciousness could be anywhere else.
There's a clear teaching about that.
There's what?
They have different kind of consciousness. You find these teachings.
What if somebody says consciousness is in the brain?
Brain is the most unimportant organ.
Well, but that's not the answer to the question, right? The question, because some people will argue and say, if consciousness is in the brain, how would you say no?
No. Brain is only the former. It's getting the commands from the consciousness. This is residing in the heart center.
Okay. How many people agree with that?
This is a teaching of Buddha Shakyamuni. It's not my idea.
No, I understand that. We're trying to figure this out, right? So how many people would disagree with that? She said consciousness is in the heart. Yeah.
I think when we are alive,
Yes.
it's we call mind. When we are dead, it's called consciousness. That's I thought.
So when we are alive, we have no consciousness?
No, when we are alive, we call mind.
Okay.
When we are dead, we don't call mind for dead body. We call consciousness. Another way to look at. That's what I thought. I saw some of that explanation in some Ayurvedic textbook, explaining, when we are alive, we never call, it's my consciousness here.
Okay.
We call it's our mind.
Okay.
And in reality, your question is very difficult. We will never get an answer.
I mentioned that was my disclaimer at the beginning. That we will never, I shouldn't say never, but we certainly not in this conference, not this afternoon, we won't get the answers.
I don't think so.
But if we can even understand the question, I think we've achieved quite a bit.
Analyze about the self or I, or what your topic is. So where you are going to put, as you are saying, this is eye, this is ear, this is nose. No, we cannot pinpoint. So whole body as a composition is called I or self.
Okay. And if you become less than the whole, will you become less than I?
No, it's like, like if you for example, when you put a dot, red dot on a white paper, when you blow up, the dot is gone. When you concentrate it, that dot will see. It's like in bottom line, it's emptiness. The I, or so, whatever we call it, is boiled down to the emptiness. That's the Buddhist concept.
Okay. So there's a Buddhist concept, okay? That's one concept.
Yeah, it's a one concept.
It's one concept.
Yeah, of course, there are
Right.
billions of universe, so we have billions of concepts.
Sorry?
It's a perfect concept.
Well, we can go on talking about that, but then everybody has a different story to tell, right? So I think we have to be open to individual stories. It's usually what, sorry?
The Kyushi is based on that, on this Tibetan medicine. It's based on Buddhism.
But the question is more universal, right? Because others may have a different answer to it.
Yeah, for this maybe the conference we should make one about consciousness.
Well, consciousness is one part of that, but I started out with the biology, and then we can go on to chemistry, and we can ultimately get to physics.
The body level.
It is what, sorry?
This is more the body level.
Body level, yeah. You can talk about physical, you can talk about mental, you can talk about spiritual. So there are ways in which you can talk about the I, right? And the cellular is only one, the genetic is another, which gives us a number of ways of diagnosing and treating. Okay, I'm trying to bring it back to this idea of personalized care. In order to give personalized care, you have to understand the person. And you have to understand the person from your perspective, you have to understand the person from their perspective. So there has to be a definition that is acceptable. And you have to find an agreement. I mean, if you take one definition and you tell your patient, this is the way I think you are, and you are not open to hearing their story or their perception, then I think there is going to be a mismatch. And as a physician, this is one of the things that we have to be at least open to in our conversations with our patients. So when I trained, I went through a regular allopathic training system, and it has as you know, the traditional mechanistic reductionist approach to medicine. And it's good for several things, but not good for everything. One can argue it may not be good for most things, but it's certainly good for certain things. I trained as an orthopedic surgeon, so if you break a leg, it's pretty good. Meditation doesn't help very much at that time. Can help a little bit, but not very much. But there are many other things. So chronic backache, for example, very, very common situation. Very complex clinical situation to deal with. And this idea of understanding your patient in these multiple facets becomes crucial at that point. Okay. Now, there's one other way of looking at the self, which is the molecular method, right? You look at the molecules. You have all sorts of molecules, right? Millions of different types of molecules. Which is the commonest molecule that you have? Water. H2O, right? What percentage are we H2O? 70% by weight, if you usually go. In terms of number of molecules, we're about 99% H2O, okay? Guess how much research has been funded by NIH on H2O? Approximately 0. In the entire history of NIH, approximately 0. But there's been lots of research dollars on many other things. We think we know everything about H2O, but if you talk to the material science people, okay, not chemists, but material science people, there's a lot of things that we don't know about H2O. Plenty of things about H2O, and if you're interested, there are lots of wonderful things you can read up about H2O from the material science perspective. Microcrystalline structure of water, the presence of memory in water, there are all sorts of things that have been talked about, but it requires a lot of further research. We had just sort of scratched the surface of that, okay? So this idea of where is memory, where is the mind, again, if you go to the chemical basis for that, we really don't know where it is. Okay, that's the best answer we can give. In a scientifically validated method, if you want to approach it, there is really no good answer for that. The best is it's in every cell, somebody mentioned that. Is it in every molecule? And you can go even further than that, right? So this idea of, in physics and in maths, there's a concept called the fractal approach to understanding anything. I don't know how many of you have heard about the fractal method of looking at. So very briefly, the fractal idea is that depending on scale, you can get the same model again and again. So the solar system looks just like the atom with electrons and neutrons, just like the solar system is with the sun and the planets. So this notion of fractal repeats itself depending on where you are in your scale, from the very micro nano to the very macro, okay? And so one way of looking at the self with the cell is that every cell of these 100 trillions are individual living beings, right? And we are the cells of the planet. So the 7 billion of us are contributing to the health of the planet in some meaningful way, along with everything else, right? All the giraffes and all the oak trees and everything else who are contributing to the health of the planet in some way. We have a consciousness of our own. Does the liver cell have a consciousness of its own? Does the liver cell think, oh, I'm one of these 100 trillion cells, I've got to do my part? We don't know. But it's just a way of thinking about who am I? And approaching health and disease with that frame of mind, frame of reference. Again, see, I use the word mind in order to understand where we are. How do we grasp this in some meaningful way in order to address the problem of making a holistic diagnosis, and then from there figuring out what the approach is to the treatment for this patient? Okay, so I want to pause there for a moment, and if there are any comments from the survey or from anything that we have talked about, this is a wonderful time to take this opportunity to have a couple of comments, because I want to be mindful of the time, and we're going to segue into the panel, which was supposed to be for this afternoon. So any other comments or any other observations about whatever we have talked about so far about the survey, or your own notions of this topic?
Yes.
I think my group is signaling for me to make a comment on behalf
Sure,
of us.
please,
We
perfect.
did our homework.
Yes.
So I'll draw your attention then to two of the questions on the survey.
Okay.
Number 32 and number 43 we discussed.
Okay.
The first one is, I am happiest when I am with a group of people, talking, laughing, singing, dancing with friends, engaging in competitive adventurous activities, or having a quiet, comfortable time alone or with a few good friends. And the second question is, my spending habits tend to be spontaneous, sensible, and frugal. And so one of the questions we had is, so this is in accordance to the categories of Lung, Chipa, and Bacon. So what do these have to do with our habitual patterns then? How do these categories influence our habits, such as spending? And another thing is one of our members had a predominance of low, but yet she's very frugal, and she thought it would be the opposite, that she would be more spontaneous in her spending or more impulsive. And so then we were kind of discussing what the actual meaning of spontaneity was. And then everyone pointed out that for many of these categories, it wasn't an either or type of situation, but it could be all three or straddled between the two. And then whether we should pick the one which is predominant, or how should we understand these categories. And then similarly, I make the point that any of these descriptions, particularly with regard to spending habits, or I'm happiest, we could be all three, but at different times. And so one of our members said a good way to, maybe the way she understood I am happiest when I am ... was thinking about how we derive our energy. Some people feel more energized when they're with a group, and some people feel more energized when they're alone. So she chose to understand the question in that way. And yeah, so these were just some points we're bringing up. How exactly is our habit pattern in particular, and our particular neuroses, or our whatever it is that is our habitual pattern, how is it related to these categories?
Excellent. Well, thank you for doing your homework, first of all. That was a very nice summary, so thank you. Wonderful. And that's an excellent segue for actually the panel, because the panel is going to talk exactly about some of those things, about the approach to how these things fit in terms of the consultation with the patient, in terms of making a diagnosis. So thank you for that. I'm going to hand it over to you, Yang Jun. Okay.